Yaish will be going first on suboptimality and DeFi, and I guess I just need to put this. I think they want you to put on the microphone. Yep, and then from beginning, is that good on the slides? And then I think your clicker is already on. That works. All right, and you have 15 minutes, and then a 10-minute discussion.
So this is joint work with Maya Dotan, Kai Watchin, Aviv Zohar, and Arthur Gervais. And our goal in this paper is to study optimality and suboptimality of users in decentralized finance. Toward that end, we study three semi-important primitives: collateralized lending, flash swap-based arbitrage, and flash swap-based liquidations. I'll explain soon what these mean. We cast each one of these as an optimization problem, and we produce optimal executions of these primitives, and we compare the optimal execution to real-world transactions to study how suboptimal they are. So with respect to lending, we show that liquidity providers could increase their profits in some cases by more than 100%. And we also show that with respect to arbitrage, arbitrageurs are suboptimal by about 4-point-something million dollars, which is not a lot. But besides doing that, we use our data to also uncover fun fact. So I guess most people here have heard about private transaction relays. So not the same relays as in the previous talks, but these are services that allow users to transmit transactions in private. So they don't pass through the public mempool. And usually these services don't even ask for anything in return, no compensation. So it's kind of weird, right? Operating them costs money. So how do they make money, like Ty Cobb fan here asked? So we uncover, using our data, circumstantial evidence showing that some private transaction relays actually use the private order flow that flows through them to make a profit. So let's start with the first primitive, collateralized lending. So I assume people are familiar with Compound and Aave. Two lending pools. They use a very simple metric to determine their interest rates. It's called the utilization. It's simply the fraction of the amount of money that's borrowed out over the amount of deposits that are currently in the pool. And interest rates are monotonically increasing in the utilization. We also have this green utilization, okay, this kink. Before it, interest rates grow at a relatively slow pace, and after it, it's a relatively high pace. Overall, on the face of it, it seems quite reasonable that for high values of utilization, meaning in cases where a lot of money is borrowed out, that we'd want to increase our interest rates so that borrowers would repay their loans and new providers would supply liquidity, right? Otherwise, we'd be in trouble if some of our existing suppliers would want to cash out. On the other hand, when utilization is low, it's reasonable that interest rates would be low as well because our money is just lying around, no one's taking it. We want people to take loans to pay us interest, so we'd set the interest rates to be low. If you try to cast the optimal execution of supplying liquidity to such pools, you get something like that. And surprisingly, it's not always optimal to supply all of your liquidity. Sometimes it's optimal to supply less. And even more surprisingly, in some cases, if you have some liquidity already supplied, it's better for you to withdraw part of your liquidity, right? This, I don't know, seems quite baffling that you'd want to take out some of your money, but it actually increases your absolute profits in some cases, your absolute profits. So as an example, back when we wrote this paper, in Aave's curve pool, there was a single liquidity supplier that supplied roughly 80% of all liquidity. That supplier could have withdrawn 28% of its liquidity and increased its absolute profits by 700%, which is a large number. So one obvious flaw with what I just said is that this may increase absolute profits in the short term. But by withdrawing liquidity, we increase interest rates. which means that it's suddenly lucrative for other people to resupply the liquidity that we've withdrawn. But surprisingly, it seems like in some cases, people aren't too keen about resupplying liquidity. You're smiling. It seems fun, right? So 1 month after I put this paper online, we saw a live demonstration of what I just described. The same supplier I just mentioned, literally the same one, withdrew some of its money, not 28%, and jacked up the interest rates for roughly 1 week, okay, which is a lot. So in cases we are dealing with thinly traded assets, what I described can also work over longer periods of time. So that's the first primitive. I actually don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to run through it. The second one is flash swaps. So I guess that everyone here are familiar with decentralized exchanges, swaps, and flash loans. Flash swaps are the combination of flash loans and swaps. They're just the two things in one go. I guess that most people here have heard about arbitrage and know that in some cases, if we want to close arbitrage opportunities, we need some upfront liquidity. And if we don't have that, we can take out a flash loan, and that would sort us out. So instead of taking a flash loan and doing a swap to close arbitrage opportunities, we can just use flash swaps. If you take the time to just pick random blocks and pick random transactions, you could see that in many cases, transactions that close arbitrage opportunities are followed by consecutive transactions immediately afterwards that close very similar arbitrage opportunities. For example, in one transaction, we may see someone closing an arbitrage opportunity between wrapped ETH and USDC in Uniswap version 2 and Uniswap version 3, and in the transaction immediately after, someone would close the same arbitrage opportunity, but in Uniswap version 3 and SushiSwap. Okay, so it seems quite weird. This is kind of a heuristic for suboptimality. If all of these transactions use flash swaps, it means that the first transaction could do the same things as the latter transactions, right? Because all of them use flash swaps, they don't need any upfront liquidity. The first one could do whatever the rest are doing. So this is kind of indicative of suboptimality. We measured this type of suboptimality over some period of time, and we found that transactions are suboptimal by about $4 million, which again is not a lot, and maybe less interesting. But the nice and interesting thing we did find out was that Ethermine, which were the largest Ethereum pool back at the time, around the time they started their private transaction relay, an arbitrageur suddenly appeared. That arbitrageur only created transactions that appear in Ethermine's blocks. And when Ethermine closed their relay, that arbitrageur also suddenly stopped working. The arbitrageur had transactions that sometimes appeared at the end of consecutive transactions, which were suboptimal, sometimes trailing private transactions. All of these things kind of hint that maybe the arbitrageur was in contact with Ethermine. Maybe Ethermine disclosed some of the private order flow to the arbitrageur. Maybe. This is speculation, but it's weird. And this is in spite of Ethermine claiming for at least one time that they would not act on the information received from their relay. Yeah. So the last primitive is flash swap based liquidations. So in collateralized lending pools, in case that the value of the collateral in a debt position falls like, to a larger degree below the value of the debt, then the debt position is available for liquidation, meaning that someone can repay some of the debt and get some of the collateral at a discount. Many tools and many users use flash swaps or flash loans and swaps to perform liquidations. And this means that if they were to liquidate a large debt position, then the swaps that they would use to perform the liquidation would change the exchange rate between the token of the collateral and the token of the debt. And this means that in certain cases, it will be suboptimal to liquidate the entire amount of collateral that's possible, that's allowed by the lending pool. And instead, it would be better to liquidate a lower amount. So that's it. To conclude, decentralized finance users are suboptimal. Tools are suboptimal. We hypothesize that maybe it's due to a lack of knowledge, lack of tooling, or maybe just people don't care. So that's it.
The discussant is Jiasun Lee from George Mason.
Should I stay here? Like, how?
Yeah, maybe if you can hand off the microphone.
Okay.
That's all right, I guess.
Be easy.
Let's see here, your slides. I see this research paper session. There we go. And you have 10 minutes.
Okay, hello. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to discuss this very, very nice paper. And just to a quick summary of what this paper is about. So it talks about some suboptimalities, suboptimal decisions in the DeFi ecosystem. And it really is like two aspects of DeFi. One is in the lending protocols, and there are actually two aspects of that. First is that in terms of the lenders to the DeFi lending protocols, they could have reduced their lending amount for a better interest rate and to actually boost their lending profit. And the second is that liquidators should have taken into account the slippage when they take out flash loans to liquidate those some portfolios. These holdings. And also just that automated market makers, arbitragers across automated market makers often are followed by similar subsequent arbitrages. Right? And the paper argues that these follow-up arbitrage indicates that the initial arbitrage probably is not optimal. Because if it is optimal, then there should not be any follow-up arbitragers. Right? So this is basically kind of a summary about what this paper. So I would like to just add some comments on all of these different aspects. So first, in terms of the suboptimality in lending decisions, so I think this is probably the most clear-cut results out of all three, right? The way we can think about why there's suboptimalities in lending decisions is I'm trying to draw something that is familiar to economists, right? So on the left-hand side, what we have is how interest rate is set on typically on those lending platforms, right? It's based on this so-called utilization ratio or utilization rate, and this is like the amount of that is being borrowed divided by the amount that is being supplied. Right, so and the interest rate actually is an increasing function of the utilization ratio, and typically it will actually have a kink at some of the very high levels. So, right, so you can think about the utilization ratio. We have the deposit amount in the fund supply, right, in the denominator. Right, so if we keep the demand for funding as fixed, then if we just flip that aside, right, so then we can just have a very familiar downward sloping curve for economists, and we can really think about this as almost like just a demand curve for lending, right? So, and if we know that there's a downward sloping demand curve, right, and for economists, what we want to know that if you are trying to supply to these markets, right, what you want to do is to equalize marginal revenue and marginal cost. And so we know that if you just supply a lot of capital to it, it's not going to be optimal. Right? So the question, of course, is that I think that in terms of the paper implicitly assumed that the marginal cost of providing these lending is zero, which I think is kind of reasonable because like we can think about a lot of cost of acquiring this capital is sunk. Right? But the question is, how do we determine what is the marginal revenue? right? So I think some implicit assumption, like most of the quantitative results that the paper gets, is implicit assuming that we are optimizing as a monopoly, right? So if you're running as a monopoly, then the market demand curve is really just like the demand curve that an individual supplier is facing, right? But of course, in reality, a lot of these markets probably are going to be oligopolies, right? So then the marginal revenue is going to be different, right? The demand curve that a oligopoly faces is going to be different from a monopoly. So then, so I think that may have some implications on what the result would be. And also, the one implicit assumption is that, like, when we draw this demand curve here, right? The implicit assumption is the demand for funds, right? The borrowing amount doesn't change, right? We need to keep that fixed in order to draw that curve. If the borrow amount changes, the curve itself will actually shift. So I think in terms of quantification of the results, right, we are assuming that the borrowers do not adjust when utilization or interest rate changes. So I think if we take that into account, and then some of the implications will be slightly different. So my suggestion to the authors is to at least discuss. I know it's going to be difficult to take all of them into quantitative considerations, but at least I think it would be helpful to kind of point out so that we can have a more objective view about the magnitude of these results. Right. And also just think about, okay, good. And also just think about how to interpret these results. Like, so actually myself has gone through different views when looking at these results. When I first look at the title and the abstract of the paper, I think, oh, suboptimality, it means that some participants are being naive. Right? And then as I read the paper more, I think, okay, like the reason why some of the participants may take what seems to be suboptimal decisions, maybe just because all these curves are kind of not very well designed. So this is actually a design flaw of these lending protocols. But actually now, after finishing reading the paper, I think that the interpretation probably is the following. Because like regardless of what the utilization or an interest rate rule that you set, right? Eventually, we can try to convert it into some like a downward sloping demand curve, which is probably very natural to economists, right? So if we face a downward sloping demand curve, then of course, like the optimal lending amount is not going to be something that you just lend all your money. There's going to be an interior solution. So in order to make like what those naive behaviors to actually become optimal, right? What we really need is to have a very flat demand curve. And I think that, so maybe the result is really the indication that just DeFi lending market is still a very new market, right? So it's not competitive enough. And that's why we have not a very flat demand curve. So in terms of like, in terms of the implications that we can learn from the paper is not like about how to fix the protocols to avoid these problems. Actually, I think the way to overcome these problems is actually to grow those platforms, right? So then when it's become more competitive, then potentially we'll see a more flattened demand curve, and that some of the so-called suboptimal decisions will actually become more optimal. Right? So that's just one way I think in terms of how to interpret these results. And in a second, just in terms of the suboptimality in these arbitrages, right? So the observation is that consecutive transactions exploit the same type of arbitrage, and so that is interpreted as a sign of existence of suboptimal decisions. But I think we want to make a distinction between what appears sequential on-chain exposed may not necessarily mean that they are sequential exposed, ex ante, right? So it could just be that there are many competing arbitrageurs, right? They are quote unquote simultaneously submitting arbitrage trades, and which eventually they got settled on chain. And of course, when they got settled, they have to appear in certain order. So I think the fact that we observe these transactions, there are follow-up transactions in sequence. May just have a different interpretation. So I think if we account for such possibilities, that may change the magnitude in interpretation of the results. Okay, and just in terms of the arbitrage, right? So basically, here's a graph. This is kind of not necessary because we just have after the launch talk and we talk about all the relay market. But really, we have just like what we have is like it's a very complicated market. There are relays that may pass transactions along. And So the paper has this point about like there are hints of relays in trying to exploit private informations. And my suggestion is that maybe we want to move this out as to a separate paper. And the reason is because the paper is really about, I think what the paper is really about is suboptimality in the DeFi space. And we would certainly be interested in understanding why these suboptimal decisions appears in the first place. And the relays, whether they exploit this information or not, right, it's actually not actually helping us to understand that question. So we need to have some suboptimal decisions in the first place in order for relays to actually be able to exploit them. So I think that's why there's one suggestion that I will have to the authors. And just in conclusion, I think that it's a very informative paper. So this is kind of an indication of a nice paper because the results, once you read it, right, exposed, it's kind of obvious. But ex ante, just nobody look at this. This is usually a sign of a very good paper. And so I think how I like this about this paper is that this paper demonstrates the importance of the interdisciplinary thinking in the blockchain research as what the CBER conference is trying to do. And because typically computer scientists and developers, they come up with all these new products. And also, and that's very important, but also it takes economists to look at them more carefully to help people really optimize and do better. And with that, I think I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we have 5 minutes for questions.
Someone.
I'll start. What is the source of that particular form for the kinked interest rate rule?
To be honest, I have no clue beside like the intuition I gave that.
Somebody here coded up?
People actually code it up. It is.
But there does not seem to have been much. I haven't seen. Congratulations, but I haven't seen any comment on how that was designed.
Intuitively, it seemed to me that it makes sense that if you're close to one, right, you're close to insolvency in some sense, and you'd want to incentivize behavior that would push you away from there, right? And on the other hand, if you're close to zero, then you're just not making money, so you want to kind of move forward. I can't tell you why they chose like that specific value because it seems ad hoc and they change it all the time, but yeah.
I think Jiasun said that correctly. I think I'm sure, I can bet you, even without seeing the data, I could have bet you that the algorithm they're using is not optimal for any set of frictions. So, but that doesn't mean that's not a good idea to have come up with a product, which is sort of what Jiasun was saying. That is, there are new products. They start with, at least from an economist's point of view, seemingly ad hoc and arbitrary assumption. No, you find some economic, you think it's plausible, but I'm not so sure. I could have told you this is not optimal. And then over time, as you found, for example, there would be serious money left on the table, and then you improve it, Of course, the frictions that you think are material have to be taken into account in the design of the optimal rule. So anyway, so I'm saying you've done a very interesting and valuable paper, but as an economist, I would have predicted that there will be serious suboptimality in the strategies of different players, I think, in fact, Fahad may be writing a paper on this. Fahad, do you have a paper? I don't know. I don't know whether you wanted to talk about that.
We can talk about it later.
Yeah, I think it's question and answer.
But the parameters are being voted upon every 2 weeks or so, right? So the interest rates and the kink point can actually be changed, right? So in principle, now there's a question here for an economist again is, do the people that vote actually have anything at stake that makes them want to change this in an optimal manner? So that's a completely different question.
But you could look at the data, and usually the people that vote are like Gauntlet or A16Z, the people who should care because they have money there, right? And the people who should understand also, I hope.
What I'm trying to say is from a market perspective, there is lenders, borrowers, and system designers. They have all, could have aligned incentives or may not, so that's a bigger question.
The point of monopolistic versus, that's crucial.
Yeah.
You know, things will be there as long as it's not strictly dominated. Then it's okay. Things, you know, if it is strictly dominated in the typical game theory sense, then that's damn wrong. Right? Otherwise, nobody knows wrong.
Nobody knows what?
You cannot claim that that's suboptimal.
Hello, I have a question regarding the second last point about coming up with new products.
Please.
Yeah. Market valuation of these new products in terms of the potential for the global economy, in terms of wealth generation, opportunities from these new products.
You mean for these lending protocols, like?
The second last point, developers come up with new products,
Okay.
techies participate.
Oh yeah, so I think just like, I mean, I think the interaction is like practitioners or developers, right? They come up with these protocols, and that provides something that economists can study about, because otherwise we get very bored, right? And also I mean, our input, right? Because we do bring in additional insight. I think Aviv's paper, right, is like this optimization, whether things are optimal or not. This is like, if you talk to developers, I talk to developers a lot, and that's not something it's just not in their DNA. So they cannot do derivative. Basically, that's the point. So like, so they think about things in discrete math, right? So I think that's all the point is. Like, I think there's a lot of value from the interactions between just the developers and economists.
Okay. Sorry to cut things off, but I've been instructed to keep the tight schedule given the commissioner's deadlines for the next session. So unfortunately, we'll have to move on to the next paper, which is on proposer-builder separation. Is Agostino here now? Yep, there he is. Control L, and there should be this. And then, are you sound? You got the microphone?
Yeah, good.
All right, and you have 15 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you. And my apology that I thought that somewhat I was speaking in the next session, but I should have looked at the program. So thanks to the organizer for putting the paper on the program. And this is basically somewhat a nice continuation of the discussion that we had over lunch about proposer-builder separation, where I'm trying to look at what are the incentives behind like proposing builder separation, and also whether or not we are really achieving the intended purpose of decentralizing the ecosystem. And that's joint work with Svein Olafsson, who is also in the audience, and Rizeja, who is a former graduate student. So the basic idea is basically decentralization. I mean, that's the principle upon which blockchain has been built, and the main idea is to ensure resiliency against manipulation, attacks, selfish mining practices, and so on. And traditionally, like the role of proposing and constructing blocks on the chain has been delegated to validators. And basically, validators have control about what type of transactions to include in the block, including internal transactions, which are transactions that they directly initiate themselves, public transactions, which are basically available publicly in the main pool, or private transactions, which are transactions that are sourced from private order flow providers, which generates the so-called exclusive order flow. These are really transactions that the validators get to see because they establish direct communication channel with these order flow providers. And in a picture like the traditional picture of the ecosystem, like for example, this was like the ecosystem of Ethereum before the merge, is that we have public mempool transactions, individual searchers, private order flow. They are all basically collecting and constructing these transactions so that they can be given or assigned to the validators, and the validators will basically go ahead and construct the block, and there will be the whole mechanism of proposing the block and validating the block and finalizing the block that we have seen also in the discussions over lunch. Now, I think one of the questions that one asks is the system really decentralized? I mean, that's, I think, what we really want to achieve, right? Blockchain has to be decentralized. And I mean, the argument is that, I mean, basically not really, and that was one of the reasons why I think Ethereum came up with the idea of separating the role of proposer and builder. I mean, to understand why this may not be, why decentralization may not be attained, I think it's useful to think about what type of compensation the validators get. No? They are compensated with newly rewarded tokens, newly minted tokens. This was the case also in proof of work. I mean, this is the case in proof of work. This was the case also in proof of stake. But then there is another component, which is the transaction fee, right? And this is really determined by the value of the block. Like what the value of the block is determined by the sequence of transactions that are included into the block. And because of this variability, because there is a lot of opportunities to reorder the transaction, to include transactions which are like maximizing the value, this creates somewhat a disparity between different validators depending on how good they are in selecting the transactions, sequencing them, and making sure that they generate a lot of value. This value is also called maximal extractable value for the reason that in the end, who is extracting this value is the validators, right? Because they are the ones who are tipped to include the transactions into the block. So, as I mentioned before, this variability in fee rewards was basically creating some validators, giving some validators an opportunity to be much stronger than others simply because they were able to better access order flow and to better process this order flow. It's not only about accessing, but also processing them and making sure that it's sequenced in the right way. Now, I think proposer-builder separation was, was one framework somewhat proposed by Ethereum in order to avoid the problem of centralization, at least partly to avoid this problem. And the idea is basically to separate the role of validators. So the validators do not have to both propose and build the blocks, but rather the task of building block is now a task of the builders. So what the builders will do, they will basically fill the blocks with valid transactions. So they will take internal public or private transactions, like internal transactions generated by themselves. Public transactions are those available in the mempool. Private transactions are those that can be sourced from order flow providers. And then they will try to compete in an ascending first price auction. So usually they have to convince the validators to take their block and append them to the blockchain. How do they make sure that they are selected? They have to bid sufficiently high so that they are winner of this auction. And then that's what the validators will do. A profit maximizing validator will take the transaction or the bid which is the highest, and then they will take the block from this builder. And this is like, in a nutshell, how the situation now looks like. We see that there is an intermediate role between the transactions and the proposers and the validators, which is basically the builders. So the builders are accessing this transaction, and then they are processing them, building the blocks, and competing in an auction to decide which block will be eventually selected by the validator. Okay, so now there is basically one key question that we are asking in this paper. Is this system really achieving decentralization, right? What does it, for one is to clarify also what decentralization means. Here I think we are basically thinking about whether or not the validation power is being distributed uniformly across validators. Is this objective being achieved? And if not, then what is happening, right? We are trying to study precisely somewhat the economics of this mechanism. And what we show, or what we find in our paper, is that definitely PBS is reducing centralization among validators. So in that sense, it's achieving the objective that it was asking, like to reduce centralization. But and in fact, I think we are also arguing that this reduction in centralization power among validation is even like achieved more. So that means there is more decentralization if the builder market is in a way very strong. So the builders are very proficient, they're very good at extracting order flow and at constructing blocks. However, there is an unintended consequence that we are highlighting. Basically, now the centralization problem is shifted to the builders. So it was a centralization in validation, now it's shifted in the builder market. And we don't have a solution yet to how to reduce centralization in the builder. So we basically are highlighting that there is this problem. And I will skip the literature review for the sake of time. There are few papers that have looked, or they're starting to look at centralization problem in blockchain, especially after PBS. Especially, there is also the paper by Fahad, Casper, and Barnaby, right, that was discussed over lunch, which is more looking at the economics of Ethereum post-merge. And I think this is actually an area that still requires a lot of work to understand better what are the problems. And I'm going to basically compare two models. The benchmark model, which is the pre-PBS model, so before we had the separation between proposer and builder, and then I'm going to discuss what happens after this merge. So the model is the simplest possible model we can think of. Maybe it can be even simplified more, but basically the idea is that we have m validators, each of them has a stake. So this is the situation where validators are basically earning rewards depending on their stake. So the value of the block that they are building is basically equal to this quantity EIV, which captures in a way the block building ability, how good are the validators at selecting this order flow and adding it into the block, and X is the extractable value that there is from order flow that is accessible to the validators. Like, the assumption we are making is that there is an economy of scale here, which means that validators with larger stakes, they also have better block building ability. And then the revenue of the validator is simply given by its stake, percentage stake. So S is the total stake in the system. SI is the stake of validator I times the expected value of this block built by the validator. So that's like the benchmark model. Now I want to discuss the PBS model. So the PBS model is basically a model where we have both validator and builders. The builders, there are n of them, so it's a competitive market, and their characteristics are how good they are at building blocks and how good they are at accessing order flow. So the value of the block builder I is basically equal to AI, which captures its block building ability, and this is idiosyncratic to the specific builder, times the accessible order flow that they have, which could come from public transactions, which is X, and private or exclusive order flow, which is the XI. So that's the one really exclusive to the builder I. And then, of course, if the builder is good at extracting value from this order flow, this will increase the value of his block. And we are modeling the extractable order flow as basically a random variable, which could be equal to VI, which is the value extracted with probability PI, and with probability 1 minus PI, it will extract 0. So that means that if they are good, somehow they will be able to extract order flow with this probability. So they have to invest in a way, or they have to have a good internal searching ability or good accessibility to exclusive order flow in order to extract value from whatever is available. And we assume that there is an initial value PI0, which is basically the initial somewhat accessibility to order flow by the builder I, and then there will be an additional quantity P to the I, which will be endogenously decided, and it depends on how much additional order flow this builder get allocated from order flow providers. So PI0 is basically their initial accessibility, and P to the I is how much more they will get from the order flow providers. And basically what the builders will do is they will acquire the MEV from this order flow provider, and they will offer them a rebate fee. So this is a reward that they give to the order flow provider for basically getting access to this order flow. And if we look at the objective function of the builder I, it's basically he has to choose a rebate fee which maximizes its objective. And its objective is basically given by the expected value difference between the first bid and the second bid, right? Because this is a first price auction, ascending first price auction, which is basically equivalent to a second price still bid auction. So the truthful bidding is the dominant strategy. And for the payoff is basically the difference, because you pay the second highest bid and your block is valued at the first bid. And Fi P to the I is basically the fee, the rebate that they have to give to the order flow provider. And the objective function of the order flow provider is basically given by this quantity here, which basically captures the value of the order flow provider, like for selecting a transaction which has high probability to be included. So this capital PI is the probability that the builder I will be the winning builder. And ETA is the rebate fee that the order flow provider get from the builder I. So if this quantity is large, it means that they are selecting a builder which is good. And then the other two terms basically are capturing aversion with respect to concentration. You don't want to allocate order flow only to the same builder. And the last term is capturing some capacity constraint, the fact that the order flow is limited. We look at the subgame perfect equilibrium of the game. So first stage, there is a selection of the rebate fee by the builder, and then in the second stage, the order flow provider will decide which builders to allocate order flow. So let's look at the results of the model. I think in the benchmark model, validation, centralization is easy to see that it happens in the validation, because essentially what happens is that the validator which has the largest stake, they will be able to get a larger reward. So the revenue per stake will go up. As a result, they will be able to stake more. And so they will increase again the probability of being selected. And this basically generates centralization. Unless, like, all validators are equally skilled at selecting order flow, there will be some validators which basically dominate over others. Now, in terms of instead the market when we have builder, what we can show is the following, that if there is an initial advantage in private order flow acquisition by a builder, so for example, PI0 is larger than PJ0, so builder I has a larger skill, is better able to extract order flow than builder J initially, then it will basically always have a larger probability of being allocated order flow by the order flow provider. So these order flow providers will be allocating order flow to the builders which have a larger build in the beginning. So that basically means that if you have an initial advantage, which means that your PI0, your initial probability is larger in order flow acquisition, then you will basically be able to have a higher value of the blocks that are being built, simply because the order flow provider will select you with higher probability. This will basically mean that you will have a higher number of validated blocks, and then you will get even more order flow, right? So that's the feedback effect. So if you have initial advantage in order flow acquisition, you will get more order flow, and as a result, you may think that this will lead to builder centralization, right? Because the stronger builder, the one with the larger PI0, especially if the gap between the PI0 and PJ0 is large, will basically end up being the dominant builder in the ecosystem, which is not far from what we observe. I think this similar slide was also discussed over lunch. So here, if we look at the snapshot, this is the snapshot that I've taken yesterday from the Mentpix from the website. We see that there are basically 3 dominant builders in the market. And if you look at the dynamics over time of the builder market, you see that it's tending more and more towards centralization, right? We had more decentralization in October 2022, but now we see that it's getting much more concentrated, which is in line. Of course, I'm not saying that this is the only argument, but this is an argument to show why we have decentralization. So in terms of validation, instead, there is decentralization. So here, I think, forgive me about this type, but this means SI larger than SJ. So if we have 2 validators and one validator has a larger stake than the other, what we are arguing is that this difference between the return per unit stake of validator I and validator J is decreasing, so it's getting smaller and smaller if any of the builders become more sophisticated. Either it has a larger probability of accessing order flow or more skilled in extracting order flow, which basically means that a stronger builder market, a builder market where builders are more proficient, is somewhat reducing the gap between return per unit of validators. So it's basically leading to a more decentralized validation system. So more competition, if we have stronger builder market, it's good for validation. We achieve a more decentralized outcome. And final point, and it'll take really 1 minute to discuss, is basically how about validator and builder integration? Would the validator want to be a builder or not? And if that's the case, then what happens, right? And essentially, there are 2 reasons, or 2 incentives why a validator wants to build block. One is that they might enhance the value of their own block if they're a builder, right? Because they can provide more valuable transaction into the block. Or if they become builders, they can build block for others. So if I'm a validator, I don't have to build a block for myself if I become a builder. I can also build a block that will be then used by another validator, right? The reason, and what we are basically showing here, and if you can, you can skip this derivatives, but the idea is that if we have a stronger builder market, then validators will be able to extract enough rent from the competing builders. And as a result, if they can extract more rent from the builders, they have a weaker incentive to be builders, right? Because they can get already order flow from the builders. But if we have a weaker builder market, where builders are really not constructing very valuable blocks, which means that their B2 or B1 is low, then validators have a stronger incentive to build. And these basically terms are captured by this quantity B1 and B2, which is the highest bid and the second highest bid by a builder. If we have a stronger builder market, then both of these bids will go up. If both of these bids will go up, then the marginal value from building your own block as a validator, as well as the marginal benefit of building block for other validators, is going down. And if it's going down, that means that basically the value of the validator, the order flow, of the order flow provider in allocating order flow to validator I is increasing in the share of this validator. So that basically, to summarize, the validator that has the stronger incentive to become a builder is the largest validator, because the largest validator is precisely the one for which this quantity will be the highest. And this basically brings me to the end. The main punchline here is to understand whether or not under PBS we are achieving the intended objective of the centralized validation system, and the answer is yes, if the builder market is very proficient. But on the other hand, we are introducing another form of centralization, which is centralization in building. So in the end, it seems like shifting the problem from validators to builders. Thank you.
No. And the discussant is Zhiguo from Chicago. You have 10 minutes.
Thanks for the organizers to inviting me here. I heard about the PBS several times, never got a chance to really read it carefully. And this is the chance that I actually read a bunch of related papers that you guys cite, and as well as Ethereum.org explanations for the PBS. And I will actually spend half of my time on line by line, just telling you how I read. And I didn't know that in our lunch, there's a similar treatment, which I found it's very interesting in the sense that I will tell you how I think about when I read all these, the way they think about it. Okay, so let me go on. I'm gonna recap the paper bit. So this is a very coherent analysis on proposal builder separation in the following sense that, I think that I read a lot of other like CS econ type of paper. Oftentimes they do a lot of shortcut. It's not like I'm criticizing them. It's just that what they were doing is really, really complicated. But what the paper I read that you saw, it's extremely coherent in the sense that every single part is microfounded. Okay. Separation alleviates the monopolistic rent from proposals and validators. Proposal/validators, they're the same. But the same issue pops out for builders. That's like a one-line takeaway. Remind us the issue of the risk has to go somewhere. It's, I'm a financial economist who working on banking, financial system, macroeconomics. Risk has to go somewhere. It's, I have to ask, if you do this way, where does the risk go? Okay. So as Agostino's agenda, he was always trying to say centralization is an unstoppable force. That's obviously I'm along with you. This paper is sitting between computer science and economics. As an economist, actually, the model I think you should even further stylize. I will tell you the model ingredients shortly to make the analysis sharper. The ingredients that I see you actually is pretty new in the economics framework, because you have several layers of this like a Kuno type of analysis equilibrium. So that would be useful. But maybe if you send to the CS side, then too much abstraction makes analysis non-applicable. So that I also kind of have a similar paper with Hana. We always try to strike the balance. All right. So this is the model. There are three players. I'm only looking at the interesting part of the PBS market, right? That's the new, with the economics plus the computer science. There are three players. One is called order flow provider, okay, at the high level. And then order flow provider is a respond to the fees that are offered by the builders, okay? Then after the builders, builders basically do all these things and supply these blocks to the proposers, okay? So proposer should be. So there's the three people. Okay, so now layer by layer. The order flow provider is only one. He can receive all these bids from all these builders, and he's gonna allocate different orders to these guys. And there's a bunch of a simplification thing. You remember that you see that there's some binary structure in the sense that the order flow goes through actually affected the probability of you getting a good order. For that way, because the order flow there is just the probability, so that makes when you take the derivative, basically there are two terms. One is occurs with the probability. The other side it occurs with the 1 minus probability. So that's the simplification that they did in order for them to do following this linear structure. Okay. Now, then given the alpha, what is alpha? Alpha is all these builders, the price sent to me, okay? Then big O is only one guy. The way that they write down the payoff is basically as if linear quadratic. Even though they didn't roll that way, they take the approximation, then in the end it look like linear quadratic. This little o notation, typically we don't do it as economists, but I totally understand why you do this. Essentially, you get this form, which is that when I as O think about a different P goes to, just basically order flow goes there, that will have a baseline effect here. This is alpha I hits in, and then you have this penalty on the quadratic part. One thing that they emphasize is the strategic substitutes, Aij less than 0. That means that when I as order provider, I'm giving more order flow to Jiasun, that means that that hurts my position on my order flow to Will, just because that if I give him, he might win, he might lose. Okay, that's very simple. All right, once you do that, then you can solve for the big P as an alpha. Both are boldface, which means a vector, and then builder I will choose alpha to maximize the following, which is that I win and I pay the second highest bidder. Okay, so you see that this is two layers. This part is similar to Kuno game, but more complicated. So that's why that I appreciated the work is that you have a first layer linear quadratic problem, then you build on another layer of Kuno problem. Then finally, they maximize. This is basically captures that the proposer still have their own option. They can do their own stuff, and this is coming from the market. So that's the structure, and then they just solve it. Okay, so the main results. You have this machinery. The main results is very simple. The proposers now can pick the best block in the market. This helps curve the strong guy's rent, strong guy as a proposer. And that's because the best block on the market is available to everybody, every proposer, at that level of the playing field. Okay, there's some question, but it's not important. I already communicated with this. The second big point is that because builders are heterogeneous, so it's very important. I'm gonna pounding on this point. Now they're assuming that builders are heterogeneous, okay? Heterogeneous in terms of the ability. The builder with better endowment will acquire more order flows and become even stronger. So that's the amplification effect that you see this as a main result, which is proposition 5.1. That's the centralization forcing the builder market. I totally agree with you. And then they talk about many other things. All right. So this is where that I said that I'm going to go through this PBS with you, that just walk with you, that my reading it, and I think it's an interesting way of this. This is basically on ethereum.org, Manabu or Banabu. He talked about it. Okay, so the whole idea is the block builders become responsible for creating blocks and offering them to proposers, so they level the playing field. Proposer cannot see the block of content, so they simply choose the most profitable. And this is why they're doing this. This is what the Ethereum was saying, is that first address the transaction censorship issue because they can't see it. The second is to prevent hobbyist validators from being outcompeted by initials, to basically level the playing field. Everybody can become the validator. So that's maintain the decentralization. And then the last one is not important. Okay. So what kind of a censorship does PBS solve? Powerful organization can pressure validators to censor certain transactions. After PBS, this will no longer be possible because block proposals. Okay, whenever you see the font is not italicized, that's on the website, and I put my own comments in the italicized way. Okay, so what they were saying is that sometimes that we wanted to prevent that from happening, but the regulation part is that compliance happens at application level while the protocol remains permissionless and censorship free. Now, I think this is exactly, we see, and all the discussions of what if builders are censoring? It's the same issue, okay? Now, this is the one thing that Ethereum was talked about. The whole idea is that somehow that they think that it is okay to centralize block building. So this is exactly the point that I think Agostino, you guys should talk about it. It is very clear from Ethereum reading is that it is now what we're having is a centralization on together, the proposer together with builder. They think that, okay, once we separate them out, it is very decent, could be very decentralized on the proposer side, but centralized on the builder side. But they think it's okay. So this is the logic, okay? So separating building from proposal implies that MEV will distribute over that, allowing special builder to exist takes the burden of a block building away from individuals, all these things. This is what they're saying. It's a prover-verifier asymmetry. That's a principle of a prover-verifier symmetry. In their mind, a centralized block production is fine as long as there's a robust, maximally decentralized network, blah, blah, blah. Okay. To me, that's not sure. It's a censorship from running, etc. Are all honest. I thought staking address is the honest issue, address the honest issue. And to me, that's something that it's unclear that why do you have this prover asymmetry is enough to feel like this is the right way to do it. I have one last slide. So specialization and concentration is always the issue that I think that everybody were thinking about it. It's from an economist's perspective, what you do is basically splitting the so-called high revenue assembling task from this like easier to do. This is a blockchain protocol. I think there's a robust economics behind it, is that a block building is complicated, benefit from specialization. And if you do those very complicated stuff, then help someone else to do this easy work. That's a leveling playing field. That's what Vitalik was saying, that this ensures that at least the tendency don't lead to it. However, that from what we are thinking is that it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's that you have to understand that the rent essentially, in the end, will be connected to specialty or inalienable human capital. Otherwise, why do we work harder to build our own expertise? It just doesn't make sense from the incentive side. Separation could help to curb the rent associated with the specialty. If you look around the world in other industries, a lot of times we separate the tower companies, that when you make phone calls, tower companies are very sophisticated and all these industry, heavy investment, etc. Then you can have a telecom company, they just basically are operating with the phones. Once you separate that, then basically you separate the rent from each other. Okay. So concluding is that basically that, somehow that I feel like decentralizing is the objective in this literature. I totally fine as economists also care about equality for no reason, but in this kind of area, often ignore the efficiency discussion. We typically will mention the planner's solution first, tell you that the centralization is actually exactly what the planner wants to do, and then ask yourself, can we address certain rent issues? And remember, these agents and the firms are heterogeneous, and centralization is efficient. And if centralization is efficient, simply introducing markets often make a centralization even worse. That's exactly the market force it's at play, because some guy is good, therefore some guy would. Okay, so wait a second. Even though it could make the centralization worse, it's only looks worse. In some sense, if we design incentive the right way, in this following sense, that if the most efficient guy practices so-called effective altruism, although that we know that that's not always the case, but then centralization is totally fine, right? We know that kind of thing. Let the very, very good guy and good at everything, also well-intentioned to do that, that's fine. Ultimately, it's about the mechanism design, and this is the problem that economists has been thinking for more than, I guess, 100 years almost. Great, thank you.
So